Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, operator. My name is Ann Morse. I'm the Program Director for the National Conference of State Legislatures Immigrant Policy Project and the Task Force on Immigration in the States. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on immigrants in the workforce, how are states responding? This follows last month's webinar focused on legal immigration visas and national impact studies, economic impact studies. Each of our webinars is archived and available at www.ncsl.org/webinars. NCSL gratefully acknowledges the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. This is the fourth in our series of focuses on immigration issues. Our next webinar will be July 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern with a focus on driver's licenses, Real ID, and state innovative responses. Please visit ncsl.org/immig to register for this free webinar. We value your feedback. After each of our webinars, we ask you to please fill out our survey. Let us know what was valuable and how we can do better. Before we begin, I'd like to point out resources that are available for download at any time during this webinar. Simply click on the Media Library icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It looks like a yellow piece of paper with a blue bar graph in front of it. NCSL has collected examples of state-level studies assessing the fiscal and economic impacts of immigrants and recent state laws that seek to make better use of immigrant skills and experience. You can click on this link and it'll take you to a dozen or so state-level economic impacts. We've also found laws that are very innovative across the states. In 2011, Utah created or sought to create a temporary guest worker program working with the federal government, but they needed a waiver. That's still pending. We also found laws enacted in Massachusetts to encourage immigrant entrepreneurship, and in California to ease state licensing requirements by allowing the use of an individual taxpayer identification number instead of a social security number. We ask for your assistance and welcome it in gathering additional studies and legislation. Please send them our way. We'll give you my email address at the end of the webinar. And our speaker today also has provided two links to documents that include best practices in pursuing immigrant economic development and also an extensive collection of studies and publications gathered by the Welcoming Economies Global Network. Now please welcome today's guest, Steve Chebachman from Global Detroit. And the Welcoming Economies Global Network. Steve is a former state legislator. Yay, Steve. He was also the majority floor leader for Michigan, the second highest position in the Michigan House. He's been active in economic and community development in his state and region. He currently serves as co-director of Michigan Political Leadership Program at Michigan State University, one of the nation's premier bipartisan political leadership programs. Steve's here today with us to talk about his work at Global Detroit and the Welcoming Economies Global Network, which is a 10-state network of economic immigrant development initiatives, and to identify some best practices and capitalizing immigrant talent to support economic development. Michigan's Governor, Rick Snyder, created a Michigan Office for New Americans last year to expand on these economic revitalization strategies statewide. We will hold a question and answer session following the presentation. For those joining us via the web, please feel free to use the chat box in the lower left part of your screen and submit any questions ahead of time. Now, Steve, the floor is yours. Tell us what's been going on in the Midwest. How did you get started with Global Detroit and the regional network?
Well, and I just want to thank you and NCSL for having me and for conducting this series. It appears, I think we have hopefully it's interactive today. We don't have too many people, so that should make for a nice discussion. But I finished my legislative term. You can serve 3 terms of 2 years apiece, lifetime term limits in the Michigan House in 2008. And shortly thereafter, I was contacted in the midst of really a huge economic crisis in Michigan that predated the national crisis. So we had a decade in the 2000s that was unlike and worse than probably any state economic collapse compared to other states in American history, I would say. We started the decade as the 17th wealthiest state per capita income, and over the course of the 10 years between 2000 and 2010, lost close to 1 million to 1 million jobs, which is almost 20% of the private sector jobs in the state. And we have not recovered since. We've slowly created about half that many jobs, but half of those jobs seem to be lost forever. We're the only state to have lost population in that decade, and frankly, we went from 17th wealthiest state in the country in per capita income to 39th in the country by the end of the decade. So pretty daunting thing. So the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce and our regional chamber and the New Economy Initiative, a collaboration of 10 state and local foundations with a particular focus around Detroit and Michigan, came together and wanted me to look at immigration as an economic development issue. And so we engaged in a study about what kind of impact immigrants have had on Detroit, Metro Detroit, and our regional economy. And what we found was pretty startling, and but is something that is the kinds of results that are true across the Midwest and the Rust Belt. So we found that, first of all, our immigrants tended to be very highly educated. Close to 40% possessed a 4-year college degree or more. And you see that kind of education level only in the most sort of advanced workforces around the country. But as an industrial state, that's almost twice what the non-immigrant population, which hovered around 21% here in Michigan, had. And it wasn't just that they were highly educated. They tended to be educated in the right fields. We know that across America, between 40 and 60% of the graduate degrees awarded in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, graduate fields are awarded to international students, and that international students are literally 3 times as likely as domestic students to be majoring in these important fields. We also found out that a quarter of all the high-tech companies started in America between 1995 and 2005. Many of them the drivers of economic growth in the new economy were started with at least one immigrant founder or co-founder. And that Michigan, even though having a small immigrant population, actually was third in the country with 32.8% of its high-tech startups in that time period having an immigrant founder. And we also know that immigrants had much higher entrepreneurship rates. Nationally, they're about twice as likely as non-immigrants to start a business, and that's true on every education level, so even those without a high school degree to those with graduate STEM degrees. But actually, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration, Michigan, that factor was 3 times as likely over a 10-year period. And we know that more recent research by the Fiscal Policy Institute says that 28% of all the Main Street businesses in America, and even higher levels in places where immigrants are concentrated, are immigrant-owned businesses, and that virtually all the growth in Main Street or retail businesses in the top 50 metros over the last 13 years has come through immigrant entrepreneurship. Finally, it's not just highly skilled and entrepreneurs, but really is a matter of population and neighborhood stabilization in the city as distressed as Detroit. Immigrants are incredibly important, as well as providing a workforce to a state and community that is rapidly aging. So Detroit is the 18th largest city, despite all its woes, still the 18th largest city in the country, but it has the 135th largest immigrant population. So that was the research we did. And as a result, we identified a number of programs and strategies that we thought immigrants could be more integrated into the economy in a way that would create opportunity for everyone. And, we worked very closely with the Democratic floor leader in the state legislature, but I worked very closely with Governor Rick Snyder, a Republican here, who was fond of saying that immigrants make jobs, they don't take them. And this notion that we have a static pie, economic pie, and that every job somebody fills means a job that's not available for everyone else is a real false notion. We know that when the right people get into those jobs, the entire economy grows. In fact, according to former Mayor Mike Bloomberg's Partnership for a New American Economy, every skilled STEM graduate, international student who stays and works in the country, they create 2.62 additional American jobs for those jobs. So we launched the country's first international student retention program called the Michigan Global Talent Retention Initiative to retain that talent, an ambitious micro-enterprise training and development and lending program in inner-city neighborhoods that work with African-American and immigrant entrepreneurs. We worked on state licensing and credentialing issues for skilled immigrants who are here legally, who want to work in their chosen fields, and a variety of other initiatives focusing as an economic development matter at being welcoming. So we were working with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center to launch the Welcoming Michigan initiative as part of the Welcoming America campaign. We created a Welcome Mat network of integration services, and we've launched our cultural ambassador. So that's the work that we've been doing here. Most of these programs are 5 years old or less, but you asked in your question, Ann, what's been going on in the Midwest. And in the last couple of years, we've come to realize that it's not just Detroit, but that all across the Midwest and the industrial area of the country, we see cities that have come to their own conclusions that immigrants are an important part of their economic future and that they represent an opportunity for revitalizing neighborhoods and growing the economy, an opportunity that benefits everyone in the community. And so since 2010, Dayton, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Toledo, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Macomb County, and others, close to 20 different communities across the Midwest and Northeast have launched specific what we call immigrant economic development initiatives. And we've been working with Welcoming America to bring these programs. They've all launched independently. They all have their unique creation story. And so we've created something called the Welcoming Economy Global Network, or We Global Network. We've done convenings in Detroit and Pittsburgh, and we'll be getting together July 9th in Dayton. And we've facilitated city-to-city exchanges, learning exchanges among these peer programs. We've written, as you mentioned, the ideas that innovate chapters on state and local policy that support this work, as well as a publication called The Day in the Life of an Immigrant Entrepreneur with 11 city story contests around immigrant entrepreneurship. And finally, we have been working on issues like we did a joint day of communication around the H-1B application process to highlight how immigrant talent in these cities, not just in Silicon Valley, but how important it is to Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and growing our economy, and why federal policy is really holding us back. Although most of us are not focused on federal policy, we're focused on what we can do locally to create economic growth by being welcoming to immigrants.
Thanks, Steve, for that great introduction. I know at NCSL we're also very anxiously awaiting Congress to come back to immigration reform and get a lot of this work off the State House agenda so that we can move on to other things. But until then, we're trying to find innovative practices to do what we can in the meantime. You mentioned briefly in your comments about the H-1B visas, and I hate to bring up bad news, but there was a news article yesterday that was criticizing the abuse of the H-1B visa program. The New York Times article about Disney firing U.S. workers and hiring immigrant replacements. What's your take on these stories, and do they jeopardize the program?
Well, those stories need to be obviously, if there's abuse of the system and that they're used in this kind of way, that is not the intent of the H-1B system. There's a requirement that workers who are doing H-1B be for positions that are advertised locally. There's a prevailing wage, not necessarily prevailing wage, but there's a requirement that you pay something like a prevailing wage in the H-1B system. I would just argue that while there are abuses and that the entire system is really broken, and the use of, we just went through an application process for 85,000 H-1B applications and received literally over 200,000 applications for those 85,000, and each one of those applications has a several $1,000 filing fee plus legal fees associated. So the economy is demanding high-skilled immigrant labor, and that by and large, excuse me, those using the H-1B are huge economic contributors. There have been studies showing that they not only fill needed functions in companies, but that they create economic growth that creates more than 1.5 jobs for every H-1B worker. I would return to Governor Snyder's comments that immigrants don't take jobs. It's not a fixed pie. They make them. And, we did an event here in Michigan on April 9th around the H-1B crisis at a company called LlamaSoft. LlamaSoft is a leading-edge software solutions for the logistics industry, and it supplies everyone from Walmart to the U.S. military in helping them have software to manage inventory and the flow of goods and services. LlamaSoft has over 250 Michigan employees, and many of these employees, in fact, I think the majority of these employees make a six-figure salary. But they are in a very competitive software design environment, and they need to get the most sophisticated workers, including many who have PhDs in mathematics and information technology. And the reality is here in Michigan, 62% of the PhDs in in engineering in 2013 went to international students. It would be somewhat insane to think that LlamaSoft wouldn't be looking at that talent. And what they have found is that some of the best workers they can hire are Americans who need no sponsorship, and other ones are international workers who do need that kind of sponsorship. And so they've been using the optional practical training visa to get that talent, and then if those workers end up being valuable to the firm, they'll spend several $1,000s, on asking to see if that worker can become an H-1B worker. And what they have found is that it's like a lottery, and 1 out of every 3 applications will not be honored. And as a result, when somebody has that kind of value to them, they've actually had to continue to employ that worker and send them abroad to their offices in London or in Africa. And as the founder and CEO of LlamaSoft, a U.S. military veteran, a Gulf War veteran, said, it's his government forcing him to pay wage taxes and income taxes to another country, when the reality is that he'd love to pay that to an American worker and have that person in America and have that person build their family and their life here, but our systems don't allow it. So I know that there have been these stories about abuses. I think that they're a minority of the situations that we see, and that the laws should be looked at and fixed and repaired. And but skilled immigrant labor is a huge part of American economic success. In fact, 40% of the Fortune 500 in the world are American companies started by immigrants or their children. A full 41% of all the Fortune 500 firms, and we need to make sure that America and our local communities continue to be places of innovation and attracting the world's best and brightest.
I think that makes sense to me, and I think many of our state legislators are looking at their budget shortfalls this year and trying to be creative about how they can develop new business, new economic initiatives, and this sounds like an intriguing option for states to be looking at. But I have to ask the question, does support for immigrant workers seem to cross party lines? Are you seeing that within legislatures and in the other states you're working in?
Well, the one thing about the National Conference of State Legislators and other infrastructure built around state policy, like Governing Magazine and others, is they really focused on how much the state and local governments have become the labs for democracy and for good public policy as opposed to the federal government. And I think around immigration you see that as well. So while the federal debate is mired in this political gridlock about undocumented workers and really the fears of those in the American economy about what's going on a global level, the reality is that on a local level, you're seeing, I think, an increasing consensus among Republicans and Democrats alike that immigrants can power the economy and that they represent an opportunity for local communities. So as I mentioned, I work very closely with former Governor Rick Snyder, or not former, current Governor Rick Snyder and his staff. They have an office for New Americans that Governor Snyder created. And at the same time, we work closely with the Partnership for a New American Economy, which really grew out of Republican Mike Bloomberg's office. In fact, next week I'll be getting together with Randy Richardson, who is just left as the Senate Majority Leader in the Michigan Senate, a Republican, who also was the floor leader in the House when I first served. And we're talking about an initiative that he's working on, foreign direct investment, and how we can work together. And so it's Democrats and Republicans. Here, Mayor Mike Duggan, Macomb County Executive Mark Hackle. We have a number of leaders who are embracing this. And I think what you're seeing is here in Michigan, when I served in the legislature, there were numerous bills that at times actually moved through the chambers that were a notion that somehow, it was really kind of, I would say, a witch hunt for illegal immigrants and going after them and trying to make their life miserable, when the reality is Michigan, as a low immigration state and as a state that has had its own struggles, hasn't been attracting the number of undocumented workers as other places. And so when I was in the state legislature, based on the district I represented, a high immigration district, we spent a lot of time opposing that, really those attacks coming from, I would say, both sides of the aisle. The nice thing about Governor Snyder's leadership and the way we've talked about this issue as an economic issue, we have not had those serious kinds of attacks, trying to really jump through hoops and create a lot of bureaucracy on various state programs in an effort to kind of create this, find the needle in the haystack, and let's find out, if there are any undocumented persons who are getting benefits they shouldn't receive. I mean, nobody's an advocate that should happen, but sometimes, these compliance programs for business, they create more regulation and good that they create. We've seen, at least in this state, an end largely to those attacks since I started working on Global Detroit.
Thank you for that. Just to switch gears for just a moment, I've heard some work from Upwardly Global and organizations like them that are looking specifically at legal immigrants now that are living in our country, but they are perhaps underutilized. They have skills that they're underemployed or not working in the field that they were trained in. Can you talk a little bit about Upwardly Global in the state and how they're working with you? Yeah, so part of what has happened over the last decade is this realization that there are legal immigrants here with who have tremendous skill sets. There's also, there are just immigrants of all kinds who have tremendous economic value, but in particular, and I wouldn't lead this infrastructure. I know Upwardly Global only works with those who have legal work authorization, but there are others in this space who work with everyone regardless of status. And there's now a national collaborative called Immigrant for Immigrant Professional Integration, and it is made up of 5 members, which include Upwardly Global, World Education Services, the Welcome Back Initiative, Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians, and the Community College Consortium for Immigrant Education. But you can find it by Googling Imprint and Immigrant Professional Integration. But Upwardly Global is who we've been working closest with here in Michigan. And Upwardly Global is a national nonprofit, now with offices in 5 metros. It's about 10 years old, and it is won national awards for integration. It notices that in the economy,
skilled immigrant workers, those with a 4-year college degree or more, are 1.5 times as likely to be unemployed or underemployed. This is we're seeing a lot in Southeast Michigan of refugees from Syria and Iraq who come with an engineering degree or a pharmacy degree and are, driving Uber, working in a restaurant, working on a construction site, and really that is a missed opportunity. So first of all, those skilled fields, engineers, pharmacists, doctors, accountants, etc., there's a high demand for those skills and a high unmet demand for those skills, and we need more workers who have those skills. So the fact that they're not able to connect with those opportunities because they're not sure how to get their license or get credentials, or maybe they're just their resume, they've never been trained to write a resume that makes sense in the American context. So that's a lost opportunity, but it's also a lost opportunity that if they were to move into that job, there'd be additional jobs in the jobs that they're taking that would open up. So there'd be more Uber drivers, that other opportunities around that, or other people to work on construction sites or restaurants. So what we did with Upwardly Global is, through a grant from the New Economy Initiative, we followed the lead of New York, Illinois, and California, where Upwardly Global has chronicled the licensing requirements for those professions for people who have been trained abroad or received their education abroad. So, you're here legally to work. You have a degree from another country. Maybe you did. Maybe your residency on the degree. To understand how to get your license in a particular state is a state-by-state issue, and so each state has different requirements on how that is considered. And finding those things can be very complicated. In fact, most refugee resettlement agencies, nonprofit workforce organizations that work with an immigrant context, they're not sure how to navigate this. So Upwardly Global has now added Michigan or New Hampshire to that initial list. And in Michigan, we've continued to build on their work, and every 6 months we're adding 2 or 3 additional professions, some of whom might not even be skilled, so cosmetology, et cetera. The Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvania has done a very similar piece of work independently in Pennsylvania, so they've created a guide there. And the Welcome Back initiative is Upwardly Global's counterpart, focusing in the healthcare industry, although they work with everyone regardless of status. Once we put this guide together, Upwardly Global reported that the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Department, or LARA, under the leadership of Mike Zimmer, who is a lifelong Republican Lansing staffer and operative and leader, was so phenomenal that Mike Zimmer and Laura invested additional resources into Upwardly Global along with our state economic development agency so that they could have a full-time staff person here to work one-on-one with skilled immigrants and refugees. And we've already placed over 40 people in those high-skilled positions in just the first year of operation. And they're also pioneering something called the Global Engineers in Residence, so particularly focusing on the engineering field where, despite Michigan's economic challenges, we continue to be the automotive design and manufacturing capital of the world, and that is an engineering-intensive industry, and as a result, we cannot fill the demand for all the engineers that we need. So that's been our partnership with Upwardly Global, but it is there's a lot of background there for state legislators to consider in their own states, working with Immigrant and the other partners to map out licensing guides, and then frankly taking actions to look at difficult requirements. So some of these requirements, they come from professions trying to keep their sort of monopoly status, and so why not just restrict anybody who maybe didn't go to school in the state, or other things like that, and it could be written without thinking through foreign trained and educated workers, and that can really hurt the economy.
A very helpful coverage of the Upwardly Global and Immigrant. So hope everybody's looking for that information on the web, or call. Something that comes up perennially when we talk about immigrant workforce and shortages in this country is, why aren't we growing our own? What's the big barrier to having more Americans take on STEM jobs, for example? How can we look at balancing the work with bringing in, upgrading immigrant talent with training or retraining U.S. citizens to some of these jobs?
Right. Well, that's something that, sometimes we hear, and again, I think it stems sometimes from this fear that it's a zero-sum game, and that's just not how economies work. When we design our programs at Global Detroit and among most of our peers in the We Global Network, we are not designing programs simply to benefit immigrants. We are looking at what's needed for all of us. How do we create a high-growth economy that isn't hemorrhaging jobs? And we see that where more growth happens, and that's why we're doing these programs. But we often talk about this work being an and equation or an inclusive equation, that it's not immigrants versus domestic talent. We design our programs as much as possible to create those opportunities. So, for example, earlier I mentioned Prosperous Detroit, maybe not by name, but it's our microenterprise training, lending, and support organization. And we did the same programs we offer for immigrants in the inner city neighborhoods are offered in the African American community. And in fact, in Detroit, 85% of our graduates are non-immigrant African Americans. But I think that the STEM shortage and the skilled worker shortage, are real issues. And so while in the short term, international talent can really help make sure that we have a growth economy and that creates spin-off benefits for everyone, we do need to address our STEM and education pipelines so that more Americans are considering the kinds of professions. We need to have appropriate training and retraining programs. But I just, again, underline that this is not a zero-sum game. If an immigrant gets a job, it doesn't mean that someone else didn't get that job. It means that there's opportunity and growth usually that can benefit everyone. There was a time in Global Detroit's early years where our mayor, Dave Bing, at one point was asked about bringing immigrants into the city, and he argued that how can we bring in more folks when we have a high unemployment rate here in Detroit? And I would argue that Detroit's unemployment rate isn't because there's too many workers who have moved here looking for a fixed number of jobs, but because we lost literally 1.3 million residents in the city. And the economic activity around that those people generate in going to stores, in buying commodities, and procuring services, and using dry cleaners, and eating at restaurants, that's what has hurt the Detroit economy. And that the only way that cities have seen growth in the last half century in America has really been through new residents and immigration. And so this is really important. In other words, if we're going to have the type of public resources to invest in re-energizing our STEM pipeline, we need to be able to be a growth economy, and immigrants are an important part of that.
Well, at NCSL, state legislators are always asking me, so what's the takeaway? So looking back over the great breadth of examples you've covered today, what's the single best takeaway from your work for state legislators across the country? What questions should they be asking about their local economies? What are some of the best practices to attract and retain immigrant talent?
Yeah, I think the best practices is to think of immigration in economic terms. Too often we are simply caught in the issues of fairness and justice around the undocumented in this country, and you have some who want to say that come from a Western Judeo-Christian kind of, the least of these, or I need to take care of my brother, versus those who feel like, these people broke the law and they need to be punished. That is a piece of the puzzle, but the reality is that most of your constituents and most people really care about their job and the economy. And the reality is that when you think of these issues in these regards, whether it's restriction of driver's licenses, whether it's bilingual education, whether it's getting involved in skilled immigrant integration or international student retention or immigrant entrepreneurship programs and the support that those programs need, I think if legislators ask themselves the question, like, how will this impact the economy and how will this impact the non-immigrants, I think we would have much, that you'll see there are a lot of untapped opportunities for state policymakers to build upon. And this is really a movement. As I mentioned, there are likely to be 20 cities and probably 300 participants at the Welcoming Economies Global Network meeting July 9th in Dayton. And you can just Google Welcoming Economies Global Network. It's right on our homepage. And you're seeing, and we have really yet to develop a complex state policy playbook for legislators to consider. We have our ideas that innovate, but it's really in the formational stages, and this is an opportunity for enterprising and thoughtful state legislators to get ahead of, and it is a bipartisan initiative.
There you have it, immigrants and economics. Thanks very much, Steve. With that, I'll open it up to the audience for some questions. Please use the chat box in the lower left part of your screen to submit any questions, or operator, can you unmute and let people ask questions?
All lines are now live.
The chance is yours. Speak now. Any last thoughts you want to offer, Steve, before while people think of their questions?
No, I mean, I think we're eager to have our partnership with NCSL and others in the space to help us think about, what are the policies that states can do. I mentioned here in Michigan, Governor Snyder created an Office of New Americans and has provided important resources for our international student retention programs as well as the Upwardly Global Office. But we really are at a period where more and more local governments and state governments are trying to understand, are there investments, are there barriers that they can take action on? And we're glad that NCSL is asking these questions, and we hope that others will contribute to the innovations that are going on. One of those, which is mentioned in the laws that you track, is the GEAR program in Massachusetts. And that is that Governor Patrick had created some state funding so that universities could hire international students who were graduating and who had invented technology while studying at the University of Massachusetts and wanted to stay in Massachusetts to take that technology to market and create Massachusetts-based companies that would be cutting-edge job providers. And there are real federal visa issues that international student inventors like that face. And there's a way to navigate that by the university hiring the students because they're not subject to the H-1B cap. The students, through the Massachusetts GEAR program, are providing services to the university. And in addition to that, the university owns a stake of their company. And as they grow, the university will have an income-producing asset. And it's a real win-win, and it's been a very innovative program that is also happening in Colorado now, but not with state funding. Policies in this area are rapidly developing, and we're glad that the kind of the around the country like NCSL is tracking this area because I do think it's going to be an important part of our future.
All right. Operator, are there any questions yet? Hearing none. Thanks so much, Steve, for your great presentation today and the offer to work with us in the future. We very much like the idea of the collaboration and learning from your playbook. This concludes today's webinar on immigrants in the workforce, state-level responses. NCSL thanks again the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring this event. Thank you, Steve, for the informative and helpful presentation and for all our participants today. For those that joined late or for those that would like to listen again, NCSL will be posting this recording again on ncsl.org/webinars. Our next webinar in the 2015 Immigration Series will be held on Friday, July 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern, focusing on driver's licenses, Real ID, and how states are creating innovative responses. For additional details on how to register, please visit ncsl.org/IMMIG. You will receive an email shortly directing you to a brief survey. Please complete it as we do value your feedback. Additionally, for those who have not already done so, I highly encourage you to register for NCSL's 2015 Legislative Summit on August 3rd through 6th in Seattle, Washington. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.